Chapter 3. The Country. While Jesus' popularity was growing exponentially, he had in mind to pick a select few that he could groom for future leadership. So he spent the night in prayer, and then in the morning he invited his devotees to meet with him on the hill outside of town. From them he chose just 12 men. This group, of course, included those that he'd already specifically invited: Peter and Andrew and James and John, Philip and Nathaniel. Then he'd added Matthew, the taxman. The others were Thomas, always a bit of a pessimist; James, not to be confused with Jesus' brother of the same name; Simon, not to be confused with Simon Peter. This Simon had previously been a political activist. Finally, there were a couple of Judases, one of whom had a head for figures, so they made him the treasurer. All these became his official disciples, followers. But Jesus told them that they were soon to be his apostles, his emissaries. From then on, Jesus spent more and more time with just them alone, explaining in depth what he'd only hinted at to the wider public. So that very day, he started his new program. Aware that back in the valley the crowds were thick on the ground, he gave his disciples a whole day of private teaching. They always referred to it later as the Sermon on the Mount. It was revolutionary stuff. He told them that the truly happy were the poor, sad, hungry, and persecuted, because the long-term gain would outweigh the short-term pain. He extolled the virtues of meekness, mercy, purity, and peacemaking. He told them that they were to be as salt in a corrupt world, light in a dark room. While he may have crossed swords with a legalist, he assured his disciples that far from undermining the law of Moses, his intent was to strengthen it. Anger or insult were tantamount to murder. Lustful looks were adultery in the heart. Remarriage was generally just a polite form for adultery. Speak plainly, he told them. Yes or no is all you need, not oaths or embellishments. If someone throws a punch, don't hit back. Let them have another go. Sues you? Give them what they want. Begs or borrows? Go ahead, give it all away, since you can't serve both God and money anyway. Don't just love your friends. Love your enemies too. Good isn't good enough. Perfection. And words alone don't suffice. Practical obedience is what counts. He taught them much about prayer, which he stressed was best done in private. It doesn't have to be wordy, long-winded. Just make your point and then trust God. God already knows what you need anyway. He gave them a template for prayer, which he said should be addressed to Our Father in Heaven. They should request that his name be honored, his kingdom be realized, his will done on the ground level, just as it is in heaven. Then they should go on to pray for daily necessities, forgiveness, guidance, and protection. Persistent prayer is always answered, he assured them. He finished by defining two clear choices, two roads that appear similar at the start, but lead to radically different destinations. Two foundations for life, rock or sand, obedience or negligence. Though most of this had been directed to the disciples, the crowds had gathered gradually around to listen. Blown away is the best way to describe their reaction to such revolutionary ideas. When eventually he came down the mountain in Capernaum, he was met by a group of city fathers. Trouble, the disciples imagined. But it was not as they thought. These elders had come on behalf of the local Roman centurion, a well-respected man who was a generous benefactor of local culture and religion by all accounts. It seemed his much-loved servant was seriously sick. These elders knew on which side their bread was buttered, so they begged Jesus to come and heal the man. The centurion himself stepped forward at that point, an imposing figure in uniform with a military bearing and a foreign accent. "My lord," he addressed Jesus. "I am not worthy to have you come into my home. I know all about giving and receiving orders, so I realize that all that is required is for you to give the command, and it will be done." Jesus was impressed. Turning to the city fathers, he said, I have to tell you that in all my travels in this country, I have never encountered such great faith. Then he turned back to the centurion. "Go on home. Let it be done just as you have believed." And somewhere in the unseen world, someone saluted, "Yes, sir!" With his new entourage of disciples identified, it was now time to go walkabout. But the crowds were not ready to be left behind, so hundreds followed, and hundreds more were added to their number as they passed through communities along the way. They headed south and were approaching a border town called Nain, when they noticed another procession emerging from the town gates. At first they thought it would be more hangers-on, but as they drew closer it was plain that this was a somber procession, a group of mourners carrying a coffin. The two processions drew closer, one led by Jesus, full of joy and laughter, exuding life and vitality. The other moved slowly, unwillingly, with grief-laden footsteps, weighed down by death. At the front by the coffin was a distraught woman. By the time the two groups met, Jesus' procession had lapsed into a respectful silence. Jesus walked up to the woman, who was now standing still beside the casket. One of the mourners mumbled that the deceased was her only son and that her husband had also died recently. "Courage, lady, don't cry," Jesus said, touching her arm. Then he stepped up to the open casket, placed his hands on the side, and looked down into the face of the dead boy. For a moment there was silence, a face-off between life and death. Then Jesus spoke clear words of command. "Young man, get up!" There was a gasp from the mourners at this outrage, but then the body stirred, and the boy sat up, rubbing his eyes and looking around. "Hello, Mum! What's happening? Where am I?" Jesus helped him out of the box and down to the ground. What a way to end a funeral. Rather than continue south into Samaria, they swung north. Skirting Nazareth, since they weren't welcome there, they came to Cana, the village where Jesus had famously turned water to wine. While they were there, a finely dressed man hurried up to them, breathless. He was royalty, as it turned out, a member of Herod's court, and had traveled all the way up from Capernaum specifically to find Jesus. "It's my boy," he panted. "He's dying. Please come immediately and heal him." "I've heard it said that seeing is believing," replied Jesus. "But do you actually need to see me touch him before you'll be able to believe in his healing?" "Sir, I beg you, come quickly before my son dies." "No," said Jesus. "You go. Your son will live." The conflict was written all over the man's face as he turned to leave. Jesus was his last remaining hope. So could he really walk away with nothing but a promise? But he did. Halfway home his servants met him, jubilant. The boy was fine. "Well, when did he turn the corner?" the man asked. "What, a fever left him yesterday about lunchtime, I'd say, about 1. That was the precise time when Jesus had said, "Your son will live." Others were also trying to track Jesus down. A couple of anxious-looking young men hurried up next afternoon. Andrew, who'd previously been one of John's disciples, recognized them immediately and made the introductions. But the news wasn't good. John was in prison. Apparently he'd been outspoken about King Herod's recent marriage to Herodias. She had previously been married to Philip, Herod's brother. But Herod had gone ahead and married her anyway. John had tactlessly denied the validity of the marriage, calling it adultery. The upshot was that John had been arrested and thrown in jail. When the pleasantries had been exchanged, John's disciples explained to Jesus their mission. "John has sent us to inquire if you really are the one he's been talking about, or if we should be on the lookout for someone else." Jesus didn't answer their question right away, but invited them to stick around for a while and watch. What followed was a typical afternoon: healings, exorcisms, and sight given to blind people. Jesus' disciples were growing used to this kind of thing, just a normal day at the office. But John's followers were flabbergasted. Eventually, Jesus called them over. "So, go on home now and tell John what you've witnessed." Then he quoted a paragraph from Isaiah's writing. "The poor have good news preached to them, the broken-hearted are healed, the blind see, the dead are raised." Possibly the only phrase of the quotation that he omitted was the part that John must most have longed to hear: freedom for the captives. It must have been tough for the outdoorsmen to be locked away from the sunshine. As soon as they were out of earshot, Jesus addressed the crowd. "Why did you all flock out into the wilderness? Was it a nature walk? Or was it the latest fashions that you were checking out, wanting to see John's fine clothes, right?" Everyone remembered the leathers and roared with laughter. So why did you go? Because you knew he was a prophet. You did, didn't you? Actually, he was more than that. Despite his denial, he really was the one that Malachi told us to expect, the Elijah figure. There never was a greater man than John. But it's even better to actually enter the kingdom than merely to foretell it.